These officers are about to make the most shocking discovery of their entire life. A call for welfare check turned out to the discovery of 24 bodies in one house.
I'm disabled. It takes me a minute to get out of bed.
Okay, somebody was standing right here. I heard them. So.
No.
Okay.
Cat, maybe.
I'm Officer Davis and I work for the Truman Police Department. We received
a call from my daughter because she's pissed off that I won't let her go to my youngest go to
do a welfare check on a 10-year-old.
Go to Cherokee Village with her. She's in her room.
We'd like to see her, please. Step in here with you.
This is my bedroom. It's a mess. The rest of the house is clean. Bodie's in the back, like he always is.
Truman, Arkansas, sits in the northeastern corner of the state, a town of fewer than 6,000 people where the pace of life is measured by the slow crawl of farm equipment along Highway 49. On July 2nd, 2025, the summer heat had settled over the community like a blanket, pressing down on the asphalt and the tidy lawns that most residents maintained with quiet pride. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew one another by sight, but not necessarily by story, where the police department handled more traffic violations than serious crimes, and where a welfare check was typically resolved with a knock, a conversation, and a line on a report. But on that Wednesday afternoon, the Truman Police Department received a call that would challenge every assumption about the safety that small-town life promises. The caller was a woman requesting a welfare check on her 10-year-old sister. She explained that a family dispute had erupted after she had planned to take the child for a birthday weekend. Her mother, Samantha Platts, had canceled abruptly, citing last-minute plans that did not align with any known family obligations. More concerning, the mother had brought individuals into the home who had recently been released from jail. The caller did not know the full extent of what was happening inside the house, but she knew enough to be afraid for her sister. The dispatcher logged the request and sent officers to the address. What those officers expected was a routine call. What they found would unravel over the next several hours. Officers arrived at the Platts residence shortly after 1 in the afternoon. The house itself did not immediately stand out from the other modest homes on the street. A single-story structure with weathered siding and a front porch that sagged slightly in one corner. The officers knocked and announced their presence. The delay before anyone answered was the first sign that something was unusual. When the door finally opened, Samantha Platts stood in the doorway, explaining that her disability made movement difficult. But one of the officers had heard movement near the door moments before she appeared, and when he mentioned it, Samantha dismissed the sound as a cat. The officers identified themselves and stated the purpose of their visit. Samantha's response was immediate and dismissive. She said her daughter had called out of anger because she had been told the younger child could not go to Cherokee Village for the weekend. The officers asked to see the 10-year-old. Samantha led them inside, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the environment began to speak for itself. The smell of ammonia was overwhelming, so concentrated that it seemed to occupy the air entirely. Flies buzzed in thick clouds around the entranceway, and the floor was covered with debris that crunched underfoot. Samantha gestured toward a bedroom and apologized for the mess, but the condition of the rest of the house was already visible. Garbage was piled in corners. Cat feces were visible on nearly every surface. The officers located the child in her room, and she appeared physically unharmed, but the scene around her told a different story. What the officers initially took for simple neglect revealed itself, upon closer observation, to be a level of degradation that was difficult to process. The ammonia smell, they realized, was not merely from litter boxes that had gone unchanged. It had saturated the walls, the carpets, the furniture, a permanent feature of the home's atmosphere. The number of cats was far greater than the 12 Samantha had mentioned. Cats moved through the garbage with the same ease as the flies that filled every room. The officers asked Samantha whether anyone else was in the house. She said no. But the officers had already begun to notice details that did not align with that answer. A bed in one of the rooms appeared recently used. There were multiple sets of shoes near the back door, and the child, when asked about her daily life, spoke in a way that suggested she was accustomed to the chaos around her. The officers requested permission to look further into the property. Samantha did not object. As they moved through the house, they noted that there was very little food. Cabinets were mostly empty, and the refrigerator contained items that had long since spoiled. When they asked the child when she had last eaten, she said she could not remember. The officer's focus shifted from a simple welfare check to a more urgent concern. The child might be physically present, but the conditions in which she was living constituted neglect that could not be ignored. They had already decided that she would not remain in the home. But before they could act on that decision, the search led them to the backyard. Behind the main house stood a shed that appeared to have been neglected for years. Its wooden walls were stained, and the door was partially concealed by overgrown weeds. When the officers approached, they heard movement inside. The door opened to reveal 3 individuals who had clearly been attempting to hide. The first to step out was Bodie Williams, a man the officers would later learn was Samantha's boyfriend. He was followed by Kevin Jones and Doris Arnold. All 3 had prior criminal records, and the shed itself was filled with the same garbage and animal waste that plagued the main house. Among the debris, officers found meth pipes and small baggies containing methamphetamine. The presence of these 3 individuals in a structure behind the home where a child lived raised immediate alarms. Samantha had insisted no one else was in the house, yet here were 3 people, hiding, with drugs in their possession. The officers placed them under arrest, and for a moment, it seemed the welfare check had revealed its true purpose. A mother allowing individuals with criminal histories to stay on her property, alongside drugs, while her child lived in squalor. But the officers did not leave. The smell from the house still troubled them. The condition of the home still did not fit neatly with the explanation they had been given. They decided to continue searching, trusting the instincts that had been honed through years of responding to calls that were never quite what they seemed. During their initial conversation with Samantha, the officers had heard rumors that dogs were being kept somewhere on the property. When they asked her about it, she dismissed the claim. "There's no dogs," she said. "There hasn't been dogs for months." The officers had no reason to doubt her at that moment, but the continuing search led them to a different part of the property where the stench of decay mixed with the already overwhelming smell of ammonia. What they found was the remains of dogs, dead, decomposing, left without any apparent care. The officers paused to process what they were seeing. Animal remains on a property where a child lived was a new layer to a case that had already expanded beyond its original purpose. They photographed the scene and continued moving through the property. But it was the child herself who provided the next piece of information. As officers worked to document the conditions, the 10-year-old walked up to one of them and made a statement that seemed, at first, impossible to understand. She said there were dead cats in the freezer. The officer asked her to repeat what she had said. She did. "Some of the dead cats are in the freezer," she said, her tone unchanged. "So you might want to go in there and take pictures." The officer turned to his partner, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. But the child's words were clear, and the weight of them began to settle over the investigation. The officers moved back inside the house and located the kitchen. There was a refrigerator with a freezer compartment attached. They opened the refrigerator side first and saw a watermelon. For a moment there was relief. Perhaps the child had been mistaken. Perhaps her words had been a misunderstanding born of the chaotic environment in which she lived. But the freezer remained closed. When the officer pulled the door open, the air that escaped was cold and carried a smell that no amount of refrigeration could mask. Inside, packed into cardboard boxes stacked one on top of another, were the bodies of cats, dozens of them. Some of the boxes were labeled with food brands, as though the distinction between household provisions and the animals stored beside them had ceased to matter. The officers removed the boxes one by one, counting as they went. 24 cats. Among them was a mother cat found in a box with her kittens. their bodies frozen in positions that suggested they had been placed there while still alive. One officer noted the unnatural curl of the animals, the way they had drawn inward, the way their limbs were positioned as though they had struggled against the cold until movement became impossible. "Those cats were not dead when she put them in there," the officer said, the implication hanging in the air. The freezer had become a crime scene within a crime scene, and the officers stepped back to call for additional resources. The case had moved far beyond a welfare check, far beyond neglect. It had entered territory that none of them had anticipated. While the officers were processing the discovery in the freezer, the woman who had made the original welfare call arrived at the property. She had come to take custody of her 10-year-old sister, as she had intended to do for the birthday weekend that had been canceled. She was not yet aware of the full scope of what had been found. The officers spoke with her outside the home, and she explained the events that had led her to call for a welfare check. She told them that her mother, Samantha, had canceled the weekend plans at the last minute, claiming there were court obligations. But the daughter had also learned that Samantha had allowed individuals recently released from jail to stay in the home. She named Bodie Williams specifically and described a violent history between them, recounting a past incident in which she had struck him with a PVC pipe. "Bod's probably not a good person to be around," an officer remarked. The sister did not argue. She expressed relief that her younger sister had been removed from the home, and she described a long pattern of instability, a mother whose priorities had shifted away from her children and toward the company of people with criminal backgrounds, toward the accumulation of animals that were never properly cared for, toward a household that had been deteriorating for years. The officers now understood the full context behind the welfare call. It had not been a simple dispute over a weekend trip. It had been a calculated attempt by a sibling to extract a child from an environment that had become dangerous. With the child placed in her sister's custody and the scene secured, investigators began the work of cataloging the evidence. The 24 cats recovered from the freezer were sent for forensic examination. The condition of the home was photographed from every angle, each image documenting a space that had become uninhabitable by any reasonable standard. The legal process moved forward with charges against Samantha Platts and Bodie Williams. Both were charged with 24 counts of aggravated animal cruelty, one count for each cat found frozen in the freezer. Samantha faced an additional charge, second-degree endangering the welfare of a minor, for allowing her 10-year-old daughter to live in the conditions that officers had documented. In December 2025, Bodie Williams accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to 36 months of probation and was prohibited from owning or being around any animals for the duration of his probation. Samantha Platts did not accept a plea. Her case proceeded toward trial, with prosecutors building their argument around the full scope of neglect that had been uncovered inside the house. The 24 cats remained central to the case. Their frozen bodies, boxed and stacked in a freezer meant for food, stood as evidence of an indifference that was difficult for anyone who saw them to comprehend. The investigation did not end with the discovery in the freezer. Officers and animal control personnel spent additional hours on the property, documenting the condition of the remaining animals. The 12 cats that Samantha had initially claimed were in the house were, in fact, only a fraction of the animals that had been living in the home. Many had died before the welfare check, their remains scattered throughout the house and the shed. The living cats that were removed from the property were emaciated, covered in filth, and suffering from untreated medical conditions. They were taken to local shelters where they received veterinary care, but the extent of the neglect had taken a permanent toll on many of them. The dogs that Samantha had claimed had not been on the property for months were also found. Their remains, like the cats, had been left where they died. The case drew attention from animal welfare organizations across the state, and the scale of the cruelty became a point of public discussion. For the officers who had responded to the welfare check, the condition of the animals was inseparable from the condition of the child. Both had been subjected to an environment where basic care had been abandoned, where death had become routine, and where the distinction between living beings and household debris had eroded entirely. The legal proceedings against Samantha Platts would determine her fate, but for the animals that survived, the path forward was one of rehabilitation, and, for those who could be placed, adoption into homes where they would not be forgotten or neglected. The house on that quiet street in Truman, Arkansas, was eventually emptied. The garbage was cleared, the floors were cleaned, the walls were stripped of the ammonia that had soaked into them. The freezer was removed as evidence. For a time, the property sat empty, a reminder of what had been discovered behind its door. The 10-year-old child was placed with her sister in a home that offered stability, regular meals, and an environment where flies did not fill the air and freezers were used only for food. She returned to school, and those who knew her noted the slow, steady improvement in her health and demeanor. The legal case against Samantha Platts continued through the courts, with hearings that drew occasional attention from local news outlets, but never reached the level of national scrutiny that had followed similar cases. Bodie Williams served his probation quietly, his name appearing in court records but not in headlines. The officers who had responded that July afternoon returned to their regular duties, but they carried with them the memory of what they had seen, the condition of the home, the stack of cardboard boxes in the freezer, the casual way the child had described it all. They had answered a welfare check expecting nothing more than a family dispute. They had left with the knowledge that the most disturbing scenes are often found not in places that look abandoned, but behind doors that appear, from the outside, to be ordinary. The call that came in on July 2nd, 2025, had been answered, but the questions it raised about how such conditions can persist, about who is responsible when a child and dozens of animals are left to suffer, would remain long after the case was closed.